The morning sun bathed the Everhart estate in a golden light, illuminating the perfectly manicured gardens and grand marble columns of the mansion that sat atop the hill like a kingdom. Victoria Everhart stood at the window of her room, her delicate hand resting on the glass. Below her stretched a world she felt increasingly distant from, gilded, beautiful, and suffocating. From her perch, she could see the gardeners trimming hedges into precise shapes, the staff preparing for the afternoon luncheon her father insisted on hosting, and the imposing figure of her father himself, Lord Charles Everhart, orchestrating every detail. To outsiders, Lord Everhart's presence inspired awe, but to Victoria, it represented a cage lined with obligations, rules, and expectations. Victoria sighed deeply and turned back into her room. Her silk gown whispered against the floor as she walked, a sound that, like much in her life, was elegant but lifeless. Today was yet another day of appearances, meetings, and discussions about the future she felt slipping further out of her grasp, a future designed entirely by her father. Meanwhile, miles away, William Thornton wiped his forehead with the back of his glove, smearing dirt across his face. His workshop wasn't much, just a wooden shed with rusting tools, a battered bench, and a motorcycle half-assembled on the floor, but it was his. Every dingy corner of the place radiated the pride of a man who had built something of his own with nothing but his hands. He adjusted his cap and leaned over the motorcycle, tightening a bolt with precise movements. This was the kind of work he loved, work that spoke to him in its simplicity and honesty. His life was tough, often relentless, but it was his, and that was enough, at least until she walked in. Victoria never expected her day to take such a turn. She had managed to sneak away from her father's endless meetings on her charity project, taking her sleek black car out on an unplanned drive. The vehicle was another one of her father's choices, a machine designed for appearances rather than functionality, just like so many aspects of her life. The breakdown happened on a narrow, dusty road miles from the estate. A faint hiss escaped the car, and then came the sputtering engine, leaving her stranded. For a moment, Victoria simply sat there, the silence of the countryside wrapping around her. Then she climbed out of the vehicle, the hem of her designer dress brushing against the dusty ground. She frowned and looked around, completely unprepared for a situation like this. In the distance, she spotted the shed, a humble building that seemed so out of place in the sprawling countryside where grandeur and affluence were the norm. With little choice, Victoria began walking toward it, feeling the awkward weight of each step as the gravel shifted beneath her high-heeled shoes. William was in the middle of reassembling a stubborn carburetor when he saw her approaching through the open door. His brows furrowed at the sight. Women like her didn't walk into places like this, not unless they were lost, desperate, or both. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice formal but strained as she tried to maintain her composure. William straightened, wiping his hands on his already stained trousers, and took in the sight of her, a vision of sophistication standing in stark contrast to the oil-streaked chaos of his workshop. "Ma'am," he said, nodding slightly. "Something I can help you with?" Victoria hesitated, her instincts telling her to turn back, that this was ridiculous. But practicality overruled pride. "My car broke down," she said finally. "It's just over there on the road. Could you possibly take a look?" William's eyes flicked to her car in the distance, then back to her. "I can take a look," he said evenly, his tone polite but cautious. People like her always came with assumptions, about men like him, about the kind of life he lived. Still, work was work, and he wasn't about to turn her away. He grabbed a wrench and a rag, nodding for her to lead the way. The silence between them as they walked back to her car was thick with unspoken words, her careful distance contrasting with his natural ease. Victoria found herself stealing glances at him, a man who, with his rugged build and work-worn hands, seemed so utterly unlike the polished men who populated her world. When they reached the car, William knelt down to inspect it, the afternoon sun catching the lines of his face. Victoria stood a few paces away, fidgeting with her bracelet, unsure of what to do with herself in this unfamiliar situation. "Fancy engine," he murmured after a moment. "Doesn't like these country roads much, I guess." Victoria wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a subtle jab, but she chose not to respond. Instead, she watched as he worked with swift, confident hands, diagnosing the problem with ease. It was a stark contrast to the endless deliberations she witnessed in her father's world, where simple issues often became tangled in politics and ego. "You live out here?" she ventured after a moment, breaking the silence. "Been here a few years now," William replied without looking up. "This is where the work is? Or some of it anyway? And you fix cars? Full time?" Her tone wasn't condescending, but curious in a way that betrayed her lack of familiarity with his world. William glanced up at her then, his piercing gaze catching her off guard. "I fix whatever needs fixing," he said simply. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, that answer stayed with her long after he got the car running again and she returned to her estate. The interaction was brief, transactional, but it stirred something within her, something she didn't fully understand. That evening, during another of Lord Everhart's grandiose dinner parties, Victoria found herself distracted. She sat among perfectly arranged floral centerpieces, surrounded by guests who droned on about investments and societal achievements, but her mind kept drifting back to that dusty road and the man with grease-stained hands and steady eyes. Lord Everhart, sitting at the head of the table, noticed her distraction. "Victoria," he said sharply, drawing her out of her thoughts. "The Duke of Hastings was asking about your upcoming charity gala. Do pay attention." Victoria flushed, her composure wavering for a moment before she forced a polite smile. "Of course, father," she murmured, but the weight of his disapproval lingered. Later that night, as she sat alone in her room, the lavish world she'd been raised in seemed colder and lonelier than ever. Her mind returned to the mechanic, William. She told herself it was nothing, just a fleeting curiosity about a life so different from her own. But the next day, she found herself walking down that same road again, the memory of their brief encounter pulling her back. William heard the soft crunch of gravel before he saw her. When he looked up and saw her standing in the doorway of his workshop, he felt a flicker of surprise, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Back so soon?" he asked, leaning against his workbench. "I wanted to thank you again," Victoria said, her words sounding almost rehearsed. "For yesterday?" William studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "No need. Just doing my job." But she didn't leave. Instead, she lingered, her curiosity outweighing her usual caution. "Is this all yours?" she asked, gesturing to the workshop. "Every corner," he said with quiet pride. Victoria stepped further inside, the polished leather of her shoes seeming out of place against the grease-streaked floor. "It must be satisfying," she said softly, "to build something like this. To create with your own hands." William tilted his head, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "It has its moments," he admitted. "But it's not exactly glamorous." "Glamour," Victoria murmured, almost to herself. "It's overrated." Over the following weeks, Victoria found reasons, however thin, to venture back to William's workshop. A wrong turn during her drives, a sudden issue with her car that didn't quite warrant a mechanic's intervention, or even the need to simply stretch her legs far from the Everhart mansion. At first, William met her appearances with quiet bemusement, never prying but always wondering what she, of all people, was doing here. "Didn't think country roads were your favorite thing," he remarked one afternoon when she showed up yet again, this time holding a delicate lace parasol to shield herself from the sun. Victoria's lips curved into a subtle smile. "I thought I might grow to appreciate them. New experiences and all that." William raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning back to the engine he was working on. Victoria lingered near the entrance, watching as he moved with a purpose that seemed foreign to her world, a world of posturing and polished facades. There was something hypnotic about the simplicity and integrity of his work. After a while, she spoke again, her tone lighter. "You must think I'm terribly odd, don't you?" He glanced at her over his shoulder, the corner of his mouth twitching into the faintest of smiles. "I wouldn't say odd. Curious, maybe." "Curious about what?" "Don't know yet," he admitted, turning back to the engine. "But you keep showing up, so there's something here that's got you curious too?" Victoria fell silent at that, unsure how to respond. He wasn't wrong. There was something about William, his steadiness, his straightforwardness, that pulled her back time and time again. As the days passed, their conversations grew less awkward and more natural, the guarded politeness of their first exchanges giving way to something warmer. Victoria found herself telling William things she'd never voiced to anyone before, about her frustrations with the suffocating expectations of her father, about the emptiness she felt despite her privileged life, about the growing sense that she didn't belong in the world she was born into. William listened without judgment, his sharp blue eyes meeting hers with a quiet understanding that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't before. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes, he just listened, and somehow, that was enough. "You ever thought about doing something different?" he asked her one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the workshop in a warm orange glow. "Different how?" "Different from what your father wants. Different from all this," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the invisible barriers of wealth and status that surrounded her life. Victoria hesitated, the question catching her off guard. "All the time," she admitted finally. "But thinking about it and actually doing it are two very different things." "Fair enough," William said, a flicker of a grin crossing his face. "But you've got to start somewhere." As Victoria's visits to the workshop became a routine of sorts, whispers began to circulate among the Everhart staff and social circle. The heiress, always proper and poised, was sneaking off for long drives and coming back with dirt on her hems and a newfound lightness in her step. Lord Everhart, of course, took notice. One afternoon, as Victoria prepared to leave the estate under the pretense of a solo horseback ride, her father intercepted her in the grand marble foyer. "Victoria," he said, his tone firm. "A word, if you please." She froze, clutching her gloves in her hands as she turned to face him. His sharp gaze, so often used to intimidate business rivals, now rested squarely on her. "Yes, father," she asked, keeping her voice calm despite the tight knot forming in her stomach. "I've heard peculiar reports about your recent activities," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Driving about aimlessly, associating with questionable individuals in the countryside." "I wasn't aware my activities were up for public discussion," Victoria replied, a hint of defiance creeping into her voice. "Everything you do is up for discussion, Victoria. You are an Everhart. Your behavior reflects on this family, and I will not tolerate recklessness." For a moment, Victoria considered defending herself, explaining that her excursions were harmless and private. But she knew it wouldn't matter. To her father, any deviation from the path he'd laid out for her was unacceptable. "I understand," she said instead, lowering her gaze. Lord Everhart studied her for a moment longer before nodding curtly. "See that you do." But Victoria's visits to the workshop didn't stop. If anything, her father's disapproval only made her more determined to hold on to the one thing in her life that felt real. One evening, she arrived at the workshop with a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked along the way, a modest offering in comparison to the grand arrangements that adorned the Everhart estate, but something she hoped William would appreciate. "These are for you," she said, holding them out awkwardly. William blinked, clearly taken aback. "Flowers?" "Yes," she said, feeling slightly foolish. "I noticed your workshop could use a bit of color." A slow smile spread across his face as he took the bouquet, his rough hands handling the delicate blooms with surprising care. "Guess I can't say no to free decor," he said, his tone teasing but warm. Victoria smiled back, a sense of satisfaction blooming in her chest. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a step toward bridging the gap between their two worlds. That night, as they sat on the bench outside the workshop, talking under the light of a full moon, Victoria felt a sense of contentment she hadn't known was possible. For once, she wasn't Lady Victoria Everhart, the heiress bound by duty and expectation. She was just Victoria, a woman finding her way in a world she was beginning to see through new eyes. As the summer stretched on, Victoria's visits to William became more frequent, her curiosity growing into something far deeper. The simplicity of his life and the authenticity of his character became an intoxicating contrast to the hollow opulence she was accustomed to. Each conversation pulled her further into a world where social hierarchies didn't matter, where actions and words carried weight. William, for his part, began to open up as well. The reserved man who rarely spoke more than was necessary began sharing pieces of himself with Victoria. He told her about his late father, a blacksmith who had instilled in him the values of hard work and honesty. He spoke of his dreams to expand his humble workshop, to eventually restore the old toolshed on the edge of town into a haven for aspiring craftsmen. "You make it sound so simple," Victoria remarked one evening as he recounted his plans, her chin resting on her hand. "Doesn't have to be complicated," William replied with a shrug, his rough hands fiddling with an old pocket watch. "Figure out what you want, work for it, don't let anyone tell you it's not possible." "That's easy for you to say," she muttered. "You don't have my father to contend with." He chuckled softly. "True enough. But maybe it's not about fighting him, Victoria. Maybe it's about standing firm in who you are." The words stayed with her long after she left the workshop that evening, the moonlight casting long shadows on the winding road back to the estate. The more time Victoria spent with William, the more restless she grew within the confines of her privileged existence. Balls and dinner parties began to feel like elaborate charades. She found herself smiling at acquaintances she had no interest in and nodding politely at suitors who spoke only of money and status. Her father, however, remained oblivious to her internal turmoil. To him, everything was proceeding according to plan. Especially now that Lord Jonathan Chesterfield, heir to one of the largest shipping empires in Europe, had taken an interest in Victoria. "He's perfect, my dear," her father said one evening over dinner, his tone leaving no room for argument. "A match of this magnitude will secure the Everhart legacy for generations. You'll thank me one day." Victoria didn't respond. She stared down at her plate, the cutlery in her hands trembling ever so slightly. The idea of marrying Lord Chesterfield, a man she barely knew and cared for even less, was unbearable. One fateful afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, William found Victoria standing at the entrance of his workshop, drenched from the rain. Her parasol was missing, and her hair clung to her face in dark tendrils. "Victoria?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "What on earth?" "I couldn't stay there," she interrupted, her voice shaky. "I had to get away." He quickly ushered her inside, grabbing a blanket from a nearby shelf and wrapping it around her shoulders. "What happened?" he asked gently, sitting across from her as she shivered on an old stool. For a moment, she was silent, staring down at her soaked gloves as though searching for the words. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. "My father wants me to marry Lord Chesterfield," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's arranged everything. The engagement, the dowry, the announcements. It's all decided, and I had no say in any of it." William's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "I can't do it," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "I can't marry a man I don't love, live a life that isn't mine. But I don't know how to fight him. He controls everything. My future, my finances, even my reputation." William leaned forward, his voice steady and low. "You're not trapped, Victoria. Not if you're willing to make a choice." "What choice?" she asked, her voice breaking. "To walk away," he said simply. "From all of it. The wealth, the status, the expectations. If it's not what you want, then don't let it define you." The room fell silent, the sound of rain pattering on the roof the only noise. Victoria stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The idea of leaving everything behind, her family, her title, her place in society, was terrifying. But at the same time, it was exhilarating. "Do you really think I could do that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I think you're stronger than you realize," he replied, holding her gaze. That conversation marked a turning point for Victoria. Over the next few days, she wrestled with her decision, torn between loyalty to her family and the life she longed for. Her father's controlling grip tightened as Lord Chesterfield's courtship became more public. Victoria, however, became more distant, spending long hours alone in her room or disappearing on her drives. She knew she couldn't keep up the charade much longer. Finally, on the eve of her engagement announcement, she made her choice. With a satchel containing only a few personal belongings, Victoria slipped out of the Everhart estate under cover of darkness. She didn't look back as she drove toward William's workshop, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. When she arrived, William was waiting. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, as though he'd known all along she would come. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. William nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. And for the first time in her life, Victoria felt free. The following morning, the sun rose on a new chapter for Victoria. Instead of the cold, imposing walls of the Everhart estate, she awoke to the humble warmth of William's workshop. It was modest, rough-hewn wood, the smell of sawdust, the scattered tools of a craftsman's trade, but for the first time, she felt at home. William was already at work when she came downstairs, his back turned as he polished a freshly made chair. He looked up when she entered, offering a gentle smile. "Morning," he said. "Sleep well?" She nodded, clutching the shawl she had brought along from the estate. "Better than I have in a long time." For a brief moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the air between them unspoken but understood. "What happens now?" Victoria finally asked, her voice a mix of uncertainty and hope. William paused, wiping his hands on a cloth before stepping closer. "That depends on you, Victoria. You've already made the hardest choice, to leave. Now, it's about building something new." Her heart swelled at the weight of his words. For so long, her choices had been made for her, dictated by her father or the expectations of society. Now, she had the freedom to decide who she wanted to be. The days that followed were an adjustment for Victoria. Gone were the luxuries she had always taken for granted: handmaids, extravagant meals, carriages at her beck and call. Instead, she learned the rhythm of a simpler life, rising with the sun, helping William around the workshop, even attempting to cook a stew, much to William's amused patience. At first, her efforts were clumsy. She burned her fingers trying to sand wood and nearly knocked over a stack of tools while sweeping the floor. But with each mistake, William's encouragement steadied her nerves. "You're not here to get everything right on the first try," he told her after one particularly frustrating afternoon. "You're here to learn. Give yourself time." That patience became her anchor, and soon, she began to find her footing. She marveled at the satisfaction that came from small accomplishments, learning to saw a plank straight, successfully nailing together a simple stool, even mastering the art of washing her own clothes by the stream. Each day felt like an adventure into a world she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. But while Victoria was adjusting to her new life, the outside world was not as forgiving. When her father discovered her absence the morning of the engagement announcement, his outrage reverberated through the Everhart estate. Servants scurried to and fro, searching for any trace of Victoria's whereabouts, while Lord Chesterfield simmered with wounded pride. "She's disgraced herself," her father seethed to Lady Everhart, his pacing agitated. "Running off like this without a word. Do you understand what this could mean for our reputation? For our legacy?" Lady Everhart, though visibly distressed, remained composed. "Perhaps if you hadn't pushed her so hard." "She'll come back," he interrupted, ignoring her. "She'll have no choice. That boy, that mechanic, he won't be able to provide for her. She'll realize her folly soon enough." Despite his bravado, Victoria's father wasted no time dispatching men to search for her. Discreet inquiries were made across the town, particularly near the mechanic's workshop. William and Victoria, however, anticipated as much. For the first few weeks, they laid low, careful not to draw attention. William's friends in the town, loyal to him, made sure to divert unwanted attention. "I don't want you getting caught in this mess," Victoria whispered one evening, as they shared a modest meal. "You don't need to worry about me," William replied, his tone steady. "This isn't just about you, Victoria. It's about us now. We'll face whatever comes, together." As the months went by, Victoria's father grew increasingly desperate. The gossip circulating among the social elite had reached fever pitch, with whispered accusations and speculative theories running rampant. "Did you hear the Everhart girl ran off with a common laborer?" It's no wonder, with how controlling her father is. Poor thing. The loss of control weighed heavily on Mr. Everhart, But what truly stung was the loss of the perfect daughter he had painstakingly sculpted. One stormy evening, a letter arrived at the workshop, bearing the Everhart family crest. Victoria's heart clenched as she opened it, the words written in her father's unmistakable hand. "Victoria, this farce has gone on long enough. Return home immediately, and I may consider salvaging your reputation. Continue this foolishness, and you will no longer be my daughter. Frederick Everhart." Her hands trembled as she read the words aloud, her voice catching in her throat. William placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to lose my family. But I can't go back to that life, William. I can't." "Then don't," he said softly. "Family isn't about control or expectations. It's about love and understanding. And if they can't give you that, then maybe it's time to let go." Victoria's resolve hardened after that night. The workshop became her sanctuary and her training ground. Under William's guidance, she not only learned the trade but discovered a sense of purpose she had never felt before. Together, they began crafting furniture and tools that sold well in the market, their reputation for quality work slowly spreading. And then, one day, the impossible happened. A man arrived at the workshop, a butler from the Everhart estate, his face solemn. He carried a single letter, sealed with the family crest. Victoria hesitated before breaking the seal, her hands shaking. "Dearest Victoria, if you are reading this, know that I have finally come to understand the depth of my mistakes. Your father suffered a stroke 2 weeks ago. In his weakened state, he has had time to reflect on the choices he made, and he wishes to see you. Not to command, but to reconcile. If you can find it in your heart to return, you will be welcomed with open arms. Love, your mother." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. For so long, she had feared her father's disapproval, his anger, his control. And now, in his moment of vulnerability, he was asking for her forgiveness. "What will you do?" William asked, his voice steady. Victoria stared at the letter for a long time, her emotions churning. Then, finally, she met his gaze. "I'll go," she said softly. "Not for the life I left behind, but for closure." The next morning, Victoria prepared to return to the Everhart estate. It was the first time in months that she would face the world she had left behind, and her heart felt like it was caught in a tempest of anticipation and dread. William helped her pack, offering quiet reassurances. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, brushing his hands against hers as he folded a small bundle of clothes. She looked up at him, gratitude brimming in her eyes. "I know, but this is something I have to face myself. You've given me the strength to do that." When the carriage arrived, William stood by as Victoria climbed in, the reins held by the butler who had brought her the letter. As the horses set off, the last thing she saw was William's steady, comforting figure, his wave a silent reminder of the life she had chosen to build. The Everhart estate loomed before her as the carriage drew up to the gates. The familiar grandeur of the sprawling grounds and meticulously kept gardens made her feel as if she had stepped back into another lifetime. Yet the place looked different now, diminished somehow, less imposing, more hollow. As she stepped through the grand doors, her mother greeted her in the entryway. Lady Everhart's face was weary, but her arms opened wide, enveloping Victoria in a hug she hadn't experienced since childhood. "Oh, my darling," her mother whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I've missed you so much." Victoria's chest tightened. For so long, she had believed her mother to be complicit in her father's overbearing ways, but now she realized how much pain Lady Everhart must have endured in silence. "I'm here," Victoria said softly. "Where's father?" "He's in his study," her mother replied. "He hasn't left that room since the stroke. But before you see him, I want you to know, he's different. Weaker, yes, but also repentant. At least, I hope so." With a deep breath, Victoria walked down the hallway she had avoided in so many of her younger years. Memories of her father's harsh words and unrelenting demands flooded her mind, but she steadied herself, reminding herself of the purpose of her visit. The door to the study was ajar. She stepped inside and saw him, Lord Frederick Everhart. He looked smaller than she remembered, shrunken into the high-backed chair that once symbolized his dominance. His once piercing gaze was dimmed, and the hand that clutched the armrest trembled ever so slightly. "Victoria," he croaked, his voice like gravel. "You came?" She stood there, frozen for a moment, before stepping closer. "Yes, father. I came." For hours they spoke. At first, there was awkward silence, broken only by halting sentences. But slowly, the wall of years began to crumble, piece by piece. Her father, humbled by his condition, admitted his regrets. "I thought I was protecting you, securing the family name. But I see now that I only drove you away. All I wanted was for you to be safe, to have a future." Victoria listened, her emotions a torrent of anger, sadness, and, unexpectedly, compassion. "You didn't protect me," she said finally, her voice trembling. "You trapped me. You tried to mold me into someone I'm not, someone I could never be. But I've found myself now. And I can't go back." Lord Everhart nodded weakly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I had to try." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. But I'm here because I wanted you to know that I've found happiness. And it doesn't look anything like what you planned for me." Her father's lips quirked in a ghost of a smile. "William," he said, "that mechanic of yours. He must be something special if he won you over." Victoria couldn't help but smile back. "He is. He taught me what it means to be free. To love and be loved without conditions." They talked late into the evening, uncovering layers of misunderstanding and resentment, but also laying the foundation for something that resembled hope. When Victoria finally left his study, she felt lighter, as though a weight she had carried all her life had been lifted. In the weeks that followed, Victoria stayed at the estate, helping her mother care for her father. She made it clear, however, that this was temporary. She would return to William, to the life they were building together. Her father, though hesitant, seemed to accept this. "He'll take good care of you," he said one afternoon, his voice thin but earnest. "Not because he has money or a title, but because he loves you. That's more than I ever gave your mother." Victoria placed a hand over his. "You still have time to make things right with her, father. It's never too late to change." When the day came for Victoria to return to the workshop, her parents gathered to see her off. Her father, still confined to his chair, offered her a nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of the strength she had found. As the carriage approached William's modest home, Victoria felt her heart leap. He was outside, as though he had been waiting for her every day since she left. She stepped down and ran to him, her arms wrapping tightly around his shoulders. "I'm back," she said, breathless. William pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. "And you're staying this time?" "Yes," she said firmly. "This is where I belong." The months that followed solidified their love. Together, they expanded the workshop, turning it into a thriving business. Victoria's flair for design and attention to detail complemented William's craftsmanship, and soon their furniture was sought after in towns far and wide. Occasionally, her parents would visit, a sight that shocked many of the Everhart family's high society acquaintances. Lord Everhart, though still frail, took pride in telling anyone who would listen about his daughter's success. "She's not the heiress I imagined," he once told a skeptical guest. "She's better." As the years passed, the Everhart estate grew quieter, but it never truly lost touch with the workshop that had become a symbol of resilience and love. One sunny afternoon, Victoria stood outside with William, their first child toddling between them. In the distance, the horizon stretched endlessly, a reminder of how far they had come. "You think they ever imagined this for us?" William asked, a playful smile on his face. Victoria shook her head, her laughter light and free. "Oh, but that's the beauty of it, isn't it? We imagined it for ourselves." And with that, she leaned into his embrace, her heart full, her spirit unbroken, and her life, finally, her own. The years rolled by like chapters in a story they didn't yet realize they were writing. Victoria and William's love deepened with each shared triumph and each whispered secret exchanged late at night, when the world around them seemed to rest. The small workshop that had once been their humble beginning had transformed into something extraordinary. It became more than a business, more than a trade. It became a sanctuary, a place where art met purpose and every handcrafted piece held a bit of their love. The town thrived on their creations, and their reputation grew far beyond what either of them had imagined. One day, as they worked side by side in the workshop, a courier arrived with a letter, its seal bearing the insignia of nobility. Victoria's heart skipped a beat as she held it, her hands trembling. "It's from my father," she whispered. William placed a reassuring hand on her back. "Open it. Whatever it says, we'll face it together." Unfolding the parchment, Victoria's eyes scanned the carefully penned words. Her father's health had declined, and though his body was weakened, his spirit had somehow grown stronger, softer. He wrote not only to tell her he missed her but also to apologize once again, this time not only with words but with actions. He had set up a trust fund to be used as she wished, not to control her, but to empower her life with William. Victoria folded the letter and looked at William with tears streaming down her face. "He's trying. Really trying." William smiled gently. "And so are you. That's what matters." As the family expanded, first one child, then another, the workshop saw a new chapter of growth. Victoria found herself mentoring young women from the town, offering opportunities to those who, like her, had once felt stifled by society's constraints. These women came to her seeking not just work but inspiration, and Victoria became a beacon of strength and hope in the community. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the workshop in a warm golden glow, William looked at her with admiration that hadn't faded since the first day they met. "You've changed so many lives," he said. She laughed softly, cradling their youngest child. "Only because you showed me I could." Time passed, and the Everhart estate saw its own changes. After Lord Everhart's death, Victoria and her mother decided to convert part of the sprawling mansion into an orphanage. Her father's wealth, which had once symbolized control and restraint, was now used to nurture and uplift. Lady Everhart found herself invigorated by the work. For the first time in decades, she felt as though she had a purpose beyond societal expectations. Victoria watched her mother blossom into someone she had never truly known, compassionate, bold, and unafraid. Years turned into decades. Victoria and William aged gracefully, their love enduring like the solid wood of the furniture they crafted together. On the occasion of their 30th wedding anniversary, the town threw a grand celebration in their honor. People from all walks of life came to pay tribute, each with a story of how the couple had touched their lives. As the music played and children ran around the now expanded workshop, Victoria looked around in awe. Here was the life she had chosen, not gilded ballrooms and stiff courtesies, but a life overflowing with love, laughter, and freedom. Turning to William, who stood beside her with a broad smile, she said, "Do you think my father ever imagined this?" William took her hand in his, the roughness of his palms a constant reminder of all they had built together. If he didn't then, he'd be proud of it now. She nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I'd like to think so." As the years stretched onward, the legacy of Victoria and William grew beyond themselves. Their children carried on their parents' values, forging their own paths but always holding close the lessons of love and perseverance that their parents had taught them. The workshop, now run by their eldest son, remained a cornerstone of the community, and visitors still came from far and wide to see where it all began. The stories of Victoria's rebellion, William's steadfast love, and the unlikely union that changed so many lives continued to inspire. And in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped below the horizon and cast everything in a soft, golden light, Victoria would sit with William in the garden they had cultivated together, a sanctuary of roses, lavender, and thriving olive trees. The air would carry the faint sound of laughter from the workshop, and she would rest her head on his shoulder. "I think we've done well, William," she'd say. He'd smile and kiss her forehead. "We've done more than well. We've created a life no one else could have imagined." And together, they would watch the stars emerge, each one a tiny reminder of the infinite possibilities that life had once tried to deny them but which they had boldly claimed as their own. As the celebration for their 30th wedding anniversary died down and guests began heading home, Victoria and William remained under the twilight sky. The flickering lanterns and distant hum of cicadas created an ambience that felt almost dreamlike. "You know," Victoria started, leaning her head against William's arm. "All those years ago, I would have never guessed that refusing father's match would lead me here." William chuckled. "Do you regret not becoming the noble lady of some lord's manor?" She tilted her head back, mock gasping. "Me? Regret missing a life of endless politeness and ballroom waltzes?" She pretended to ponder. "Not for one second. What we built, this, is far richer than anything money or titles could offer." But even as she said the words, her thoughts wandered to her late father. Victoria hadn't forgotten the weight of his disapproval or the years they had spent estranged. Yet in the last months of his life, they had come to a sort of truce. His apology letters were heartfelt, though short, and their few final conversations held something that had eluded them for so long: mutual understanding. William noticed her momentary silence. "You're thinking about him, aren't you? Your father?" She nodded, blinking as emotions swirled. "I just wonder, did I do enough to show him that I was happy? That he didn't have to worry about me losing the life he envisioned? I know he didn't live to see how big this workshop became, how vibrant the town became because of his second chances." William cupped her face, gazing deeply into her eyes. "If he could see this life, feel the love you've poured into everything, our children, our work, even this town, there's no doubt in my mind that he'd be proud of you." The town, which had once been little more than a footnote to travelers passing through, had blossomed into a lively and celebrated place. Tourists often came not only for the fine craftsmanship that Victoria and William's workshop had long been known for, but also to experience the stories woven into the fabric of its streets. A local historian wrote an article titled "The Heiress and the Mechanic," which turned into a best-selling memoir that painted their romance as a tale of rebellion, resilience, and enduring love. Lady Everhart, Victoria's once fragile mother, had undergone an incredible transformation in her widowhood. She worked tirelessly to grow the orphanage she and Victoria had founded, converting spare rooms in the Everhart Manor into comfortable living quarters for displaced children and impoverished families. The funds were not just handed down but actively raised in part by Victoria's connections and the generosity of clients who loved their story. The Grand Ballroom, once home to endless elite parties, was now a lecture hall where scholars and tradesmen came to give lessons. Their children inherited the best parts of their parents. Mary, their eldest, carried on the workshop's legacy, blending William's practicality with Victoria's bold creativity. She expanded their crafting into new realms: upholstery, jewelry, and even architecture. She often jokingly remarked that, "Father made furniture that will outlast us, but I'll build spaces for those pieces to shine." Thomas, their middle child, had a flair for storytelling. Inspired by the growing fame of his family's tale, he became a writer. His stories, though fictionalized, bore unmistakable echoes of his parents' romance. Victoria often read drafts of his novels in the evenings, laughing when she spotted thinly veiled versions of herself or William woven into the characters. Their youngest, Amelia, found joy in mentoring children at the orphanage. She would return to the Everhart estate, full of energy and ideals, determined to offer even the poorest children opportunities to pursue art and trade. Amelia often declared, "It doesn't matter where you come from, what matters is who helps you take those first steps forward." The family dinners were boisterous and filled with lively debates about art, society, and life choices, because Victoria had insisted her children never feel stifled by expectation. William would sit at the head of the table, sometimes simply watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. "It's a chaotic kind of perfection," he told Victoria one night after everyone had gone to bed. One fateful day, decades later, Victoria and William received a visit from a distinguished guest. He wore a finely tailored suit but bore a humility uncommon in noblemen. It was the son of Lord Everhart's oldest friend, a young man Victoria hadn't seen since her childhood. As he walked into the workshop, marveling at the shelves of finished pieces and the hum of labor all around him, his respect for what they'd built was clear. Lady Everhart found herself invigorated by the work. For the first time in decades, she felt as though she had a purpose beyond societal expectations. Victoria watched her mother blossom into someone she had never truly known: compassionate, bold, and unafraid. Years turned into decades. Victoria and William aged gracefully, their love enduring like the solid wood of the furniture they crafted together. On the occasion of their 30th wedding anniversary, the town threw a grand celebration in their honor. People from all walks of life came to pay tribute, each with a story of how the couple had touched their lives. As the music played and children ran around the now expanded workshop, Victoria looked around in awe. Here was the life she had chosen, not gilded ballrooms and stiff courtesies, but a life overflowing with love, laughter, and freedom. Turning to William, who stood beside her with a broad smile, she said, "Do you think my father ever imagined this?" William took her hand in his, the roughness of his palms a constant reminder of all they had built together. If he didn't then, he'd be proud of it now. She nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I'd like to think so." As the years stretched onward, the legacy of Victoria and William grew beyond themselves. Their children carried on their parents' values, forging their own paths but always holding close the lessons of love and perseverance that their parents had taught them. The workshop, now run by their eldest son, remained a cornerstone of the community, and visitors still came from far and wide to see where it all began. The stories of Victoria's rebellion, William's steadfast love, and the unlikely union that changed so many lives continued to inspire. And in the quiet moments, when the sun dipped below the horizon and cast everything in a soft, golden light, Victoria would sit with William in the garden they had cultivated together, a sanctuary of roses, lavender, and thriving olive trees. The air would carry the faint sound of laughter from the workshop, and she would rest her head on his shoulder. "I think we've done well, William," she'd say. He'd smile and kiss her forehead. "We've done more than well. We've created a life no one else could have imagined." And together, they would watch the stars emerge, each one a tiny reminder of the infinite possibilities that life had once tried to deny them but which they had boldly claimed as their own. As the celebration for their 30th wedding anniversary died down and guests began heading home, Victoria and William remained under the twilight sky. The flickering lanterns and distant hum of cicadas created an ambience that felt almost dreamlike. "You know," Victoria started, leaning her head against William's arm, "all those years ago, I would have never guessed that refusing father's match would lead me here." William chuckled. "Do you regret not becoming the noble lady of some lord's manor?" She tilted her head back, mock gasping. "Me? Regret missing a life of endless politeness and ballroom waltzes?" She pretended to ponder. "Not for one second. What we built, this, is far richer than anything money or titles could offer." But even as she said the words, her thoughts wandered to her late father. Victoria hadn't forgotten the weight of his disapproval or the years they had spent estranged. Yet in the last months of his life, they had come to a sort of truce. His apology letters were heartfelt, though short, and their few final conversations held something that had eluded them for so long: mutual understanding. William noticed her momentary silence. "You're thinking about him, aren't you? Your father?" She nodded, blinking as emotions swirled. "I just wonder, did I do enough to show him that I was happy? That he didn't have to worry about me losing the life he envisioned? I know he didn't live to see how big this workshop became, how vibrant the town became because of his second chances." William cupped her face, gazing deeply into her eyes. "If he could see this life, feel the love you've poured into everything, our children, our work, even this town, there's no doubt in my mind that he'd be proud of you." The town, which had once been little more than a footnote to travelers passing through, had blossomed into a lively and celebrated place. Tourists often came not only for the fine craftsmanship that Victoria and William's workshop had long been known for but also to experience the stories woven into the fabric of its streets. A local historian wrote an article titled "The Heiress and the Mechanic," which turned into a best-selling memoir that painted their romance as a tale of rebellion, resilience, and enduring love. Lady Everhart, Victoria's once fragile mother, had undergone an incredible transformation in her widowhood. She worked tirelessly to grow the orphanage she and Victoria had founded, converting spare rooms in the Everhart Manor into comfortable living quarters for displaced children and impoverished families. The funds were not just handed down but actively raised in part by Victoria's connections and the generosity of clients who loved their story. The grand ballroom, once home to endless elite parties, was now a lecture hall where scholars and tradesmen came to give lessons. Their children inherited the best parts of their parents. Mary, their eldest, carried on the workshop's legacy, blending William's practicality with Victoria's bold creativity. She expanded their crafting into new realms: upholstery, jewelry, and even architecture. She often jokingly remarked that "Father made furniture that will outlast us, but I'll build spaces for those pieces to shine." Thomas, their middle child, had a flair for storytelling. Inspired by the growing fame of his family's tale, he became a writer. His stories, though fictionalized, bore unmistakable echoes of his parents' romance. Victoria often read drafts of his novels in the evenings, laughing when she spotted thinly veiled versions of herself or William woven into the characters. Their youngest, Amelia, found joy in mentoring children at the orphanage. She would return to the Everhart estate, full of energy and ideals, determined to offer even the poorest children opportunities to pursue art and trade. Amelia often declared, "It doesn't matter where you come from, what matters is who helps you take those first steps forward." The family dinners were boisterous and filled with lively debates about art, society, and life choices, because Victoria had insisted her children never feel stifled by expectation. William would sit at the head of the table, sometimes simply watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. "It's a chaotic kind of perfection," he told Victoria one night after everyone had gone to bed. One fateful day, decades later, Victoria and William received a visit from a distinguished guest. He wore a finely tailored suit but bore a humility uncommon in noblemen. It was the son of Lord Everhart's oldest friend, a young man Victoria hadn't seen since her childhood. As he walked into the workshop, marveling at the shelves of finished pieces and the hum of labor all around him, his respect for what they'd built was clear. "Lady Victoria," he said, bowing, "I hope you don't mind me addressing you as such?" She laughed, waving her hand. "Just Victoria will do. My days of formal titles are long behind me." The visitor handed her a box wrapped delicately in velvet. Inside was a framed portrait. Victoria gasped. It was a painting of her and William, captured during their early days together in the workshop. Unfinished wood surrounded them, their expressions youthful but filled with determination. "My father said Lord Everhart commissioned this not long before his death. He wanted something to remind him of the daughter who followed her heart," the young man explained. Victoria's voice broke. "I had no idea." "He never said anything." The nobleman smiled gently. "He was a man of few words, but I know he adored you, even if he didn't always understand you." That painting hung prominently in their home until the end of their days, a testament not only to the journey they had taken but also to the bridges they had rebuilt, even when they had seemed too broken to mend. As time slipped forward, Victoria and William aged into the twilight of their years. They continued to find joy in simple things, tending to the garden they had planted long ago, playing with their grandchildren, and sitting in quiet companionship as the world turned around them. One crisp autumn morning, Victoria woke to find William already outside, seated in their garden. His favorite book lay open in his lap, and a smile lingered on his face. She approached him with a cup of tea in hand, only to realize that he had passed peacefully in the place he loved most, in the home they had built together, surrounded by the beauty of their shared life. Victoria lived on for several years, carrying William's memory with her in every moment. When the time came for her to say goodbye, the entire town mourned, and her story passed fully into legend. The workshop remained vibrant, run by her children and grandchildren, its walls echoing with laughter and hard work. Her name became synonymous with resilience and love, a beacon for generations who followed. Victoria and William's legacy was not just in the furniture they created but in the lives they touched and the ideals they upheld. Together, they had proven that love could bridge divides, that courage could defy convention, and that happiness could be crafted with one's own hands. And though their earthly journey ended, their story continued in the hearts and memories of all who heard it, a testament to the power of living life on one's own terms, no matter the odds.